Mischief of the Sogfoot Siege. As risky as the vagrant affair had been, it was soon to be overshadowed by the trouble at Sogfoot Pond. For years Sogfoot had been a pleasant dive and the perfect pool to raise ducklings, but when a hunter laid siege, a marksman of striking deadliness, this pond had turned into a duckmarsh of death. Naturally, there have always been marksmen to make marks out of fowls, though the methods of projectiles have surely changed. And these projectiles seem to become deadlier with every passing generation. While nobody grants the birds better feather armor or faster wings, still, it's not so easy to hit the fleet-winged fowls of the wild. Being so blessed with succulent flesh, they have developed a multitude of defense systems. And if they weren't very good at evasion, none would be left in the world after an eon's worth of deadly missiles having been cast in their direction, including nature's own diving raptors. And so it's rare that any pond population would be under terminal threat from just a single marksman. But from time to time, a marksman will emerge that has such a fine eye, such a focused mind, such a well-forged barrel, and such finesse in the trigger finger, he will be not just a regular danger to a pond of paddling birds, but a disastrous, diabolical one. These are the shooters so steady, they twitch less than a critter playing dead, or even the dead themselves. These are the shooters that might go a day with barely a miss, and in short time can dispatch an entire flock to the winds of a spectral realm. And this was the very type of menace Sogfoot Pond was afflicted with. But not only was the mysterious marksman an incredible shot, he also had an insatiable hunger for the kill. Many hunters will take their fill and go home, leaving the field for some time. They will be too busy stuffing themselves with foul flesh, and their hounds too. They might even stuff and mount some colorful heads on plaques, a creepy clothback custom, though somewhat artistic in the right hands. But this man was not simply taking his humble allotment from nature. He seemed obsessed with clearing out the entire Sogfoot flock, as though it was some challenge set for him, perhaps even a crusading war. As such, he would not respect the seasons, either, whereby it was an unwritten law, and even written after a while, that hunting these ponds can only take place at certain times, and that other periods are times of peace, where ducks might drift and dive and raise their young at least safe from the flying projectiles of men. And due to this great siege of Sogfoot, the ducks were paralyzed. Many feared to stray far from the cover of the reeds. And even within they were being picked off when the wind might split the stalks and reveal their glistening feathers to the relentless hunter beyond. Eventually, under cover of heavy fog, a lone drake fled the reedy holdout and flew at great speed to secure help from Rock and Rudsnut. The pair knew of Sogfoot and from time to time had taken their own share of egg and duckling, Rudsnut even enjoying the full-size meal. Knowing this, it was a nervous visit for the drake messenger, particularly with the knowledge of their campaign at Gosgard, an acclaimed foul stronghold. But so desperate were these ducks, they were forced to plead for help from old enemies. The alarming account was given and a generous reward promised if the shooter could be stopped and the siege of Sogfoot lifted. And the fox and rook, being the crafty creatures they were, knew that if this hunter depleted the whole pond, it would be disastrous for them also. They would then never be able to hunt at Sogfoot either, except for weeds and leeches. The hunter was not only a threat to waterfowl, but to all who loved feasting upon them. Yet this was a particularly dangerous task for the pair, since while all men can be dangerous and wield deadly weapons and traps, here was a rare predator. And both Rock and Rudsnut well knew what damage lead balls could do to their hides, and also that foxes and crowbirds were popular targets for smoking barrels, being pesky threats and challenging shots. They had to be very, very careful, and even more careful than that. And they also knew this was a step up from the mischief of the vagrant invasion. Yes, those vagrants had been dangerous. If they had managed to trap and catch the pair in that barn, who knows what fate might have awaited. Rock could have easily ended up plucked and dunked in the pot, his proud beak ultimately hanging around someone's neck as a good luck charm. And Rudsnut could have easily ended up skinned and sewn into a winter hat, with his proud paw hanging off a belt for more good luck still. And who knows, with the manner in which vagrants fill their bellies, he might even have ended up in the pot also, or roasted on a spit, looking like a great fanged rabbit. But despite the threat posed, those drifters were not superbly skilled hunters. They were not true predators like the Sogfoot sharpshooter. Regardless, the brave pair did not back down from the new challenge. They backed themselves against anything the world had to throw at them. As long as they had a little time to see it coming and prepare a suitable evasion and counteroffensive, no midnight meteor striking their manor, for instance, which is simply plain unfair. As a first course of action, Rock and Rudsnut journeyed to Sogfoot after sunset, when surely the hunter was home before the fire, and even if not, when no matter how fine shooters might be, they typically will not hit a thing. Some ducks stayed up to watch their arrival and scouting circuits of the pond, telling that up close the rook's beak was the length of a hunting knife and the fox's stride as long as the stag's. The pair found a suitable hiding spot within Sogfoot's enclosing trees, Rock between branches, Rudsnut between roots, and there spent the night. And so being in prime position the next morning, Rock circled high above, well out of range of an accurate shot, and spotted the hunter arriving and setting up for another day of deadly sport, melting into the green growth to continue his siege. This hunter was so dedicated to subterfuge that to conceal himself all the better he did not use the typical hound assistant, even if he was forced to then wade and collect his quarry by hand. The rook carefully returned to his companion, and together they eased their way into a position to detect and observe this clothback predator. And it took the sharp snout of the fox and the equally sharp daytime eyes of the rook to discover the exact location of the creature, so immaculate was his camouflage. The hunter was covered in a green hooded cape, and this, along with his long beard and gloves, had been woven with leaves and embedded with moss. Only his trigger finger was bare, and still that was darkly shaded with shoe polish. Even the ardent aiming eye, poised behind the sights, was the greenish side of blue. Soon the barrel began to blast and the bills to wail and the fowls to fall, and Sogfoot waters trembled with fear and death song. The pair could see this hunter's senses were clearly as alert as the beast's. His patience was extraordinary, and when he moved to a new position, it was as though he was part of the foliage itself, blown ever so gently by the winds. They saw that the man used a muzzle-loaded firearm of old design, and this was his choice, to increase the challenge and prove to himself and history that he could match any marksman from any era and did not need the fancy assistance of modern developments. But as the assault waged on, the duo discovered that the hunter would eventually take a break from laying or crouching in perfect stillness and would then walk to the pond like a great leafy monster, and there do quite an insidious thing. He would toss bread chunks into the pond to feed the very fowl he was hunting, and by the scent of these morsels, Rutsnut could detect that they were smeared with butter, freshly churned at that. Some might believe this to be some strange act of mercy, providing his victims with a delicious last meal before the end. But don't be mistaken here. The buttered bread was offered only so the ducks might gorge and be easier targets while swimming or flying weighed down with sodden loaf. That difference might seem slight, but even a slight drop in speed can be the difference between shot flying past or flying through, and those that escaped would still fatten, making them better pot fillers down the track. It was noted by the spying pair, however, that when the hunter did this maniacal thing, he left his gun and gear behind, and lacking even a hound to keep watch, those items were completely unguarded. There wasn't a chance to take advantage at this stage of mischief, though, and eventually the hunter ended his siege for the day, taking with him his feathered bounty, hung on a special leather harness about his shoulders so that they formed a great plumed, bloodied cape down his back as he walked. A twisted funeral procession of the Sogfoot fallen. Rock and Rutsnut shadowed him for a short way, by land and air, planning to follow him home and seek methods of sabotage there. But soon the hunter detected the trackers on his tail, swinging his ever-ready firearm around with deadly intent. The pair darted left and right at full speed, as the gun swung left and right after them, then fired upon the rook, who rolled in aerobatic defense. Rock heard the searing shot zip past, and one pellet punched a hole in a wing quill, and the pair had to retreat lest they too ended up quarry slung over this siege lord's shoulders. And rest assured the sharpshooter spent hours scolding himself for that missed kill, replaying it in his head all night long so that such a failure never happened again. Still, despite this first day of scouting almost ending in extermination, Rock and Rutsnut had now collected essential knowledge to work with. Close calls with catastrophe didn't deter their wild-honed hearts, and they began that evening to strategize, determining what to do when the hunter next left his weapon unguarded. Now, Rock was an expert at hiding rations in trees, roofs, ground cover, and crevices of any kind. He could rapidly conceal items with snatched leaves, grasses, rocks, bark, or any other objects at his disposal, and make it all seem as though everything was untouched nature. Rutsnut was also experienced in such matters, though a little cruder in his methods. And with such skills, the pair wondered whether they might be able to steal the gun and hide it from the hunter. So they made an experiment right there at the Sogfoot pond perimeter, where Rutsnut dragged a stick the size of a rifle to the place the hunter had hit upon that day. The pair then directed a duck to waddle off from this location towards the pond, dab the water a number of times, and then walk back. This was to simulate the hunter delivering the bread and returning to cover. As the duck waddled away, out sprung the pair and dragged the stick gun off together, then tried to conceal it with mud and foliage. But alas, they could barely bury half before the duck was waddling back. And if they tried to simply bolt away with the gun instead of hiding it, it was clear the keen-eared hunter would hear them, and Rutsnut would lose all his famed fleetness with such a weight in his jaws and be forced to ditch the weapon in a chase. If instead they tried to dump the gun in the pond, the hunter would no doubt hear the splashing too, and easily fish the weapon out. But the pair didn't give up. When they took on a challenge, Rock and Rutsnut always saw it to the grisly end, especially if the gristle was tasty enough. And so they continued to plot through the night, camping in the wooded surroundings of Sogfoot once more. And as they were discussing tactics and experimenting with the makeshift stick gun, Rutsnut lifted the barrel up, which had a long gaping split created by the drying wood. And for amusement, Rock scooped up some sand and tipped it down this groove, mimicking the way they'd seen powder poured into real muskets still used on old-fashioned farmsteads. After this action, both looked at each other with glinting eyes. Inspiration had struck, rapidly wove its way through both minds, and though taking somewhat different side streets in those differing corvid and canned brains, ended up in more or less the same trickster town square. It wasn't long before they had a new strategy, one with great promise. And that night, nearby homesteads were deftly raided to secure supplies. With the coming morn, the returning hunter entwined himself in greenery once more, then carried on his deadly work, firing off smoky volleys of impossible precision. And sad to say, many a duck did fall or bob before the daring pair had their chance to intervene. But what else could the saviors do, while waiting for their narrow opening to strike? Finally, the hunter placed his weapon down, drew forth the bread bag, and walked to the pond. The moment had come, and the pair were in place to seize it. Rock and Rutsnut rushed to the weapon. The fox with a green wool stocking hung from his mouth, and Rock, a long straight stick. And at the sight, Rutsnut emptied the stocking, revealing a collection of gathered stones, steel nuts, bottle glass, brass buttons, and a great bent nail. As the fox angled the barrel upwards, the rook uncapped the hunter's powder horn and then tipped in a very lengthy load. So much so, he might as well have been pouring salt into a great empty shaker. Then the horn was sealed and placed very carefully back in its exact position. Now the custom ammunition was loaded in. As the fox shook the items down, unsure how materials would react in the weapon, it was decided that using as many different items as possible would increase the chances of success. This was sound Mischief logic. While they worked, the fox kept eyes, ears, and snout on the hunter and urged his companion on. With all the items loaded, the crowbird took the long stick in his agile beak and rammed it down the barrel hole to wedge those contents tight. Meanwhile, the final bread chunks were being tossed into the water, and Rutsnut gave the warning to retreat. The fox lowered the gun back precisely in its place. The rook yanked the stick, and both fled the scene. But in their rush, Rock had made a rare mistake. Looking back, both saw that the ram's stick hadn't been yanked completely clear of the barrel. If the hunter noticed this, he might suspect the sabotage, or at least inspect the barrel for other obstructions and potentially discover the nefarious contents. And back the leaf-cloaked figure now walked, thinking fast, which was certainly a talent of this bare-faced bird. Rock gathered up a few sticks in his beak and flew to the side of the gun, then yanked the ram's stick free of the barrel as swiftly as possible. The enemy was only paces away and saw the bird all too well. But Rock looked up with a beakful of timber, innocent as a crowbird can, picking up another twig too, as though he was simply collecting nesting material for this year's renovations. And off he flew, with the hunter quite satisfied that nature was simply being nature, and birds being birds. And as all rooks look quite identical to most, the man had no idea this was the very same crafty crowbird that had tried following him home the day before, with a hidden hole in a folded flight feather that exactly matched the handcrafted lead shot, so carefully melted and molded over his fireplace. So Rock and Rutsnut concealed themselves nearby, and those ducks who had a gap in the reeds to see the goings-on also waited anxiously, and a lot more anxiously than the pair, that's for sure. The fowls of Sogfoot prayed that the meddling of the duo hadn't actually enhanced the firepower of the sharpshooter's weapon, though they were assured that this was not the case. The pair had witnessed misfires before, including from a mud-blocked barrel, and decided that an increase in obstruction and firepower would only make things more effective. Even still, Rock and Rutsnut were not gunsmiths, at least not reputable ones. Could they be trusted? And while all these anxious critters watched, the hunter, calm and confident as ever, loaded his weapon, pouring in his own measure of powder and ramming in his own hand-forged projectiles. Little did he know that he now had enough propellant in that weapon to reload an entire platoon, and packed afterwards was an assortment of ammunition that had no place in even the most desperate battles. The hunter scanned with the gun sights, looking for a mark, looking for another perfect shot. And this took some time. In fact, it was excruciating for both the ducks and the saboteurs. Just shoot the thing. Rock and Rutsnut had so much time to think they were even beginning to have some second thoughts about all that powder they'd poured. What if it did actually make the gun too powerful? What if the resulting fireball sheared through the tree cover and blew every fur and feather shaft from their hides? Finally, a duck drifted into range, surely doomed like so many before it. The barrel locked on. The trigger was ever so gently squeezed by that fine-tuned finger, and boom. Not just a regular boom, but one not out of place in a battlefield cannon line. The clogged and bloated barrel blew apart at the breech, spewing burning gases into the hunter's face and hands, which also received a load of slicing shrapnel. This time it was the sharpshooter's wail that trembled the waters of Sogfoot, and flinging the smoking, mangled mess of his deadly gun, scorched and bleeding, the besieger was forced into an immediate ceasefire. And when the smoke had cleared and the moans of the fleeing foe could be heard fading into the distance as he retreated home to tend his wounds, the siege of Sogfoot Pond had finally been lifted. The ducks flocked across the pond to thank the duo, though did make sure to stay in the water and leave their plumpest members hidden in the reeds. After all, this was a fox and crowbird they were dealing with. Rock and Rudsnut ceremonially dragged the firearms spent steel corpse into the pond waters, where it sunk between the reeds and would be visited by diving ducks for generations to come, a monument to these terrible days and all who had fallen and floated lifeless before their time. The agreed reward for the fox and rook was prepared in the breeding season when a communal nest was constructed by the bank and each duck pair provided an egg, forming an impressive mound. A great, gorging feast was then had by the pair, with the leftovers carefully transported home. And though the hunter, once recovered from his wounds, did return to the pond in months to come and attempt another lengthy siege, he was never the same again. The exploding firearm had ruined his nerve for good, and his steady aim along with it. His barrel hand had developed a tremor, and his once deft trigger finger, now gnarled and scarred, would rush and yank, as if expecting every shot to be a devastating backfire. Between loads, he couldn't help checking the barrel obsessively for obstructions, reducing his shot rate to dismal levels. The more he missed, the worse his confidence became, until finally this foul slayer, a shell of his former deadly self, no longer returned to Sogfoot's duck-drenched waters, even to remember past glories under a bitterly lowered hood. And though other hunters would come and go, as is the way of the world and always will be, and a reality all ducks must accept, none proved as devastating as the solitary sharpshooter of Sogfoot. But this marksman, formidable as he was, had ultimately become just another mark of Rock and Rudsnut and their methodical mischief.